Welcome to Radio Who, What, Why. I'm your host, Jeff Schechtman. Right now, a full 19 months away from the 2020 elections, they are front and center. Every day, new polls, new candidates, and obsessive media focus on the horse race seem overwhelming. But with it all, we still have some of the lowest voter turnout among Western democracies. We have voter suppression reaching new levels in states like Georgia and Kansas. We have state officials whose job it is to oversee elections, working hard to keep people from the polls. Add to this the fear of electronic voting, growing distrust in institutions, and more money than ever in politics. It all creates a kind of anti-democratic stew. But my guest, Professor Joshua Douglas, sees light at the end of the ballot. Joshua Douglas is a professor at the University of Kentucky College of Law. His most recent scholarship focuses on the constitutional right to vote, with an emphasis on state constitutions. He's written extensively on election law procedure, and he's the co-author of an election law casebook and co-editor of Election Law Stories. Also the author of the recent book, Vote for Us. It is my pleasure to welcome Joshua Douglas to the program. Joshua, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Jeff. It's great to be on.
We do seem to be in a time where there are story after story after story that really don't paint a positive light of what's happening, but really look at some of the problems that we're facing today in terms of voting rights. Talk a little bit about that first.
Yeah, that's right. There is a lot of doom and gloom out there when people talk about the right to vote, and I think that's rightfully so, because we have elected officials, in particular those who run our elections in some places, that are making it harder for people to vote, whether it's through passing strict photo identification laws that studies show are going to cut out a certain segment of the election with no fraud-reducing benefit to the laws, whether it's cutbacks to early voting, whether it's with respect to drawing electoral districts, the practice of gerrymandering, which both sides engage in when they're in power. And it's hard not to feel a lot of doom and gloom about our system right now.
Is part of the overlay to this that voting itself, the process of voting, like everything else today in our politics, has become so extremely partisan, and that the right to vote itself has become a partisan political issue?
It is, and that's really unfortunate. It's, likely an outgrowth of the 2000 presidential election and the Supreme Court's Bush v. Gore decision, which really showed political operatives how election rules could dictate election outcomes. But I think, there's this universal feeling in our society, or at least there should be, that the right to vote is such a precious, important part of democracy that, everyone should participate. And a lot of these solutions actually do have bipartisan support. So while the voting wars, as one scholar has called it, is really become a partisan issue in so many areas, it shouldn't be, or at least doesn't have to be, when we think about what the ideals are with respect to our democracy and the fundamental right to vote.
Of course, beyond partisanship, the other thing that enters the equation is a kind of cynicism about the electoral process and about politics today that keeps people away from voting.
Yeah, there's a lot of voter apathy. There's a lot of this sentiment that my vote doesn't matter or won't count, or the system, for lack of a better word, is rigged on either side. There's, a lot of reasons why people want to throw up their hands and say, the heck with it. But I don't think that's the right answer, and that's certainly not the right way to fix our democracy.
Staying on that cynicism for the moment, there's a kind of distrust in institutions that seems to be filtering down into the voting process today.
Yeah, I think that's right as well. But again, that's a product of structural barriers to the ballot box. It's a product of the way we vote and the way we select candidates. It's a product of the extreme polarization that has entered the national debate on every issue. And it's a product of, this voter apathy that we just talked about. But again, it doesn't have to be that way. There is so much doom and gloom, and doom and gloom is what drives media stories and whatnot. But we don't have to settle for that being the storyline of our democracy. And that, to me, is really the key to how to move forward, is to reverse this notion of negativity and look for actual solutions that are happening on the ground in various places all around the country.
What is the common thread? And you talk about many of these positive developments and many of these positive things that are happening in communities all across the country. And we'll talk about some of those. But is there a common thread to these positive efforts that you see?
I think the common thread is that it's being driven by everyday Americans. Our elections are being improved not from top-down solutions, not from the elected officials themselves or the political elite, but it's really everyday Americans that most people have never heard of that are working in their local communities. And that's, I guess, the second key takeaway is that change happens locality by locality. And if we look historically at, different voter expansions, whether it's women's suffrage or the fight for civil rights and African-American expanded access to the ballot, although there were top-down solutions eventually, with a constitutional amendment or the Federal Voting Rights Act, the groundwork for that was all laid by everyday Americans in localities and in their own communities through a grassroots effort. And I think that is a common theme that we see even today with the new voter expansions that we're experiencing.
Is it positive or negative in your view that we have a voting system that is so decentralized, that is so bifurcated, that it's not only the states but local communities that control how voting takes place?
Oh, I think it's a mixed bag, Jeff. I mean, on the one hand, you have the ability to experiment locality by locality, to try something new, see it work, and then allow it to spread to other places. And that's, I think, a virtue of decentralization of election administration. U.S. Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis once said that states can be laboratories of democracy, that one state can try something innovative and new, and if it works, it'll spread to other states. And I like to say that if states are laboratories of democracy, then cities and localities can be test tubes of democracy that try things out on an even smaller scale. But there also are some downsides to the decentralization, which is that sometimes it's harder to achieve reforms if we know they're working and get them to spread to other places, especially when there's political resistance to it. So I think, it's a mixed bag. It's the system we have, and so we can find ways to work within it to improve our elections.
How much of the reform that you're seeing and some of these experiments that you're seeing are happening in red states or blue states? And is that a factor?
Well, there's certainly a skew. I guess more of the reforms that I highlight in the book are in so-called blue states or so-called blue cities. But there are a handful of them that are happening on a bipartisan basis. I point to those, and we can talk about some of them, things like felon re-enfranchisement, automatic voter registration, easing convenience on Election Day. They're happening all over and have bipartisan support. But you're right that the majority of the reforms are in so-called left-leaning areas. But, I think that's okay. It's not. That doesn't mean it's a product of partisanship. It's simply that the politics are ripe in those places, and they can lay the groundwork to have these ideas spread to other places once we prove that they're working well.
And yet you look at a situation like Florida where the electorate voted overwhelmingly for felon re-enfranchisement, and there's an effort going on right now to try and overturn the will of the voters on this issue in Florida.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate. It's anti-democratic for the Florida legislature to be trying to pass a law that would essentially undo what the voters enacted in the state constitutional amendment to re-enfranchise about 1.4 million former felons. It's going to get challenged in court if it does pass, and I suspect that it would get struck down as so clearly contrary to the intent of that state constitutional amendment. And this is why I think it's important that there needs to be a two-pronged approach to fixing our elections. We still have to essentially play defense and fight back against voter suppression and the doom and gloom. And, my book is not suggesting that work is over or is done or needs to stop. I think that this pushback against voter suppression goes hand in hand with proactive going the offense for positive voting rights reforms. And I think if we're only fighting back against the voter suppression, then we're essentially only doing half of what's possible with respect to enhancing our election system.
One of the reforms that you spend a lot of time talking about of late is this idea of lowering the voting age to 16. Talk about that.
Yeah, so when I first heard of the idea to lower the voting age to 16 for local elections, I actually thought it was somewhat off the wall. I heard about Tacoma Park, Maryland, doing it for its local elections. It passed it in 2013. And then I started researching more and actually became a very strong proponent of the idea. It makes a lot of sense. It passed in Tacoma Park thanks to the advocacy of both a council member named Tim Mail and a bunch of local youth advocates. It spread to then Hyattsville, Maryland, Greenbelt, Maryland, hopped across the country to Berkeley, California, that lowered the voting age to 16 for school board elections. San Francisco voters narrowly rejected it by about 52, 48% in 2016, but that was a big increase in the polling from when they initially started the campaign. And I just saw that Los Angeles school board has authorized a feasibility study to lower the voting age to 16 for its school board elections. So there's a lot of movement on this issue, and we can get into the details if you'd like, but ultimately the big takeaway for me is that doing this practice can create a whole new generation of engaged voters. One of the biggest predictors of whether someone is going to vote is if they voted previously. Voting is habit forming, and if you miss the first election when you're an eligible voter, you're less likely to become a habitual voter. Non-voting is habit forming as well. If we lower the voting age to 16, and the studies show and the experience shows that these 16 and 17-year-olds turn out at much higher rates than 18 to 24-year-olds, then we can create that whole new generation of engaged voters.
Do we have to have a system in place in our schools for civics education that goes hand in hand with that? Can we do one without the other? Should we try?
Absolutely, we need to also improve civics education. And that's why I spend a whole chapter in the book on ways that schools are already working to improve their civics education. And in all of the places that have passed a lower voting age, that has been supported by the school board that has tried to revamp its civics education. And what civics education needs to be is not what we sort of traditionally think of, which is memorization of facts, learning about checks and balances. That stuff, quite frankly, is boring to most 16-year-olds. It might interest me as a constitutional law person. But, 16-year-olds don't necessarily want to learn about that, and they're not going to be convinced to vote. But a lot of social studies teachers I learned, and I tell these stories, are doing what's called action civics, where they're engaging their students in real-world problem solving about actual issues. They debate issues that are in the public sphere. They take on projects. One school in Washington, D.C. noticed a problem with tardiness among their classmates, and they decided to take the issue head on. It's a magnet school, so it drew from all over the city. And they studied the issue of why their peers were late quite often, learned that transportation was not really reliable. And then they came up with a plan and went to the D.C. government and convinced them to allow students to have free public transportation during the school year. You can get a kids ride free card now for the DC Metro system. I mean, I don't think anyone would think that those students would ever forget the importance and the value of civic engagement. So if we embark on these kinds of activities, coupling it with lowering the voting age to 16, we can really revamp our electoral participation in future decades.
Having younger people vote and a younger generation vote, how does that square with a kind of antiquated system of voting we have that is at best 20th century?
Yeah, we do have an outdated voting system, although somewhat paradoxically, most experts agree that we still need to use a paper ballot system, or at least have paper ballot backups. And we think about the concerns of Russia or other countries hacking our system, the verifiability and security of voting machines. People say, well, I do my banking online, but we also see stories of banks being hacked. And so a paper ballot is, I still think, the best way, although we can revamp our voting system to make the use of paper ballots or paper backups on voting machines that would give you a backup much more convenient and inclusive. There are some pilot studies going on to use apps to vote using blockchain technology Some counties in West Virginia have used that in recent elections for overseas voters, and it seems to have worked okay. So, maybe 10, 20 years from now, that might be the future of voting. We'll just have to see. But we can adopt practices that both adhere to those security concerns and make it a whole lot more convenient for 16, 17-year-olds and actually the entire electorate to vote.
I mean, as you know, there were experiments in California after the 2000 election with electronic voting machines, and the pushback was immense. It was millions and millions of dollars that was wasted because nobody had any faith in the machines.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. But, we can change the process by which we vote on election day through things like vote centers. So instead of voting at a home-based precinct, you could vote at any vote center in the county that are electronically linked. So once you check into one place, you can't go vote at a different vote center. Or even universal vote by mail, which California is on its way to adopting statewide, also known as vote at home, where every voter is automatically mailed a ballot a couple weeks before Election Day. You don't have to request it at all. So you could take the time from your home to research the issues, research the candidates. So this actually would produce a more informed electorate, and then fill out the ballot at your convenience and drop it off at a secure drop box or put it in the mail. And what we've seen is that the states with universal vote by mail have the highest turnout. And right now it's statewide in Colorado, in Washington and Oregon, in all county but one in Utah. So this isn't a red state or a blue state type of ideal, as well as a handful of other counties in both red and so-called blue states. These sorts of measures actually improve convenience in voting, and they really work because we see the results in improved turnout.
Why has this whole issue of felon re-enfranchisement become such a central issue today? We talked a little while ago about Florida. It's already been an issue on the 2020 campaign trail.
I think because people are starting to see the moral wrongs of taking the right to vote away from life for certain individuals in our society. It used to be 4 states that had the worst felon disenfranchisement laws, that is, disenfranchise people from life. That was Florida, Virginia, Kentucky, and Iowa. Florida, you can take off the list, as you noted, because of the state constitutional amendment that just overwhelmingly passed in 2018. Virginia's governors, the past 2, have been signing executive orders to re-enfranchise felons. So now we're down to Kentucky and Iowa as the worst states. And I think the reason this has become an issue and also has had bipartisan support to repeal these laws is that people are starting to tell their stories and seeing how these individuals are reentering society. The Florida advocates refer to people as returning citizens, and they're your neighbors. They're your brothers or sisters, your family friends. And what I've noticed is that when individuals tell their stories, it can really change minds. I opened the book with a story about Kentucky, which, as I said, has one of the worst felon disenfranchisement laws in the country. But it actually got a little bit better a couple of years ago when the Kentucky legislature passed a bill to allow certain low-level felons to seek an expungement of their records. This was a bipartisan-supported bill thanks to the advocacy of this guy named West Powell. I tell his story, who is a former felon. He had stolen a car radio from an auto salvage yard many years ago, and he went to tell his story. He said, I cleaned up my life, I got a job, I married, I had kids, but I still couldn't feel like I was a full member of society because I had this hanging over my head. And in the hearing room that day was a Republican senator named Whitney Westerfield, who said he was convinced on the spot. He changed his mind. He was a law and order person who said he didn't think felons should ever regain rights back. But he heard West Powell telling his story. And so I think the power of storytelling, of seeing these people as actual people in our society, has really made a big difference.
What has been the impact in terms of that you've seen in terms of voter turnout with respect to the massive amounts of money in politics today, the amount of advertising people see, the mail they receive, the robocalls they receive? All of it has, in many cases, a kind of negative effect on voter turnout.
Yeah, and unfortunately, negative campaigning works. The political science studies show. If it's a close election, you can suppress votes for your opponent essentially through all this negative advertising. But what we've seen in the places that have adopted public financing, innovative public financing solutions like in Maine, like in Seattle with its democracy vouchers, is that this leads to campaigns funded not by wealthy interests, and that leads to less voter apathy. And so I'm not sure about the exact links on turnout and campaigning and negative ads, but I will say that when we have solutions like robust ethics reforms or campaign finance reforms, which again often have bipartisan support, at least in terms of the different iterations of it, we see much less voter apathy, and we see the ability of candidates who otherwise wouldn't be able to run, who don't have wealthy backgrounds or wealthy ties to wealthy interests, have a chance to win in certain places. And that's why you see in Maine people like school teachers or people like restaurant workers who have run for office and won because they've had the chance to fund campaigns that would actually give them a chance to win, as opposed to under a system in which they'd have to just be seeking donations.
And what is the future of situations like Georgia or Kansas where you have elected officials that are actively working at voter suppression?
Well, I think it's crying out for a solution, especially in states where you have elected officials running elections in which they're also candidates, like we saw in Kansas, like we saw in Georgia. That may be calling out for a judicial solution in terms of required recusal, but it does call into question why we have partisan elected officials in the first place. And so I think we can again point to localities in many places that don't elect their officials in partisan races. And you see these local elected officials who are really just trying to do the best job possible to make their election system fair, secure, and inclusive, and bring as many people into the political process as well. Unfortunately, statewide officials, many of them are partisan elected, and I think that's really unfortunate, and we need to come up with a solution to change those offices to not have such partisan valence. And again, perhaps it's up to the courts in those egregious examples. But I do think that there's some good news on the local level if we, champion our local elected officials who are really doing a great job on the ground.
To what extent do you think that the current debates with respect to immigration and census counting is going to have an impact that filters down into elections going forward?
Well, Jeff, I think, part of that question is dependent on what the U.S. Supreme Court does in the citizenship question case. The federal government is trying to add a question to the census that asks everyone whether they are a citizen or not, and there's some real concern about if that question is on the census, is that going to depress response rates in minority communities with a lot of non-citizens? And if that happens, I think we'll see a major effect on the 2021 round of redistricting. It also might affect the Electoral College numbers because the number of electors each state has depends on the number of members of Congress they have. So I think, that is really concerning if the court decides to uphold the citizenship question, and we'll have to wait a couple months to see what happens on that front. But then there's this other question about just non-citizen voting rights in general. There's a couple of cities in California, including San Francisco, that allow non-citizens to vote in school board elections. The theory being they're validly sending their kids to the local schools. They should have a say in local school policy. And what we see is this push and pull between voter expansions and retractions, and this whole anti-immigrant sentiment, which, by the way, is why we have registration deadlines. The history of voter registration deadlines and voter registration in general comes from the aftermath of World War I and an anti-immigrant sentiment and the desire to make sure that non-citizens were not voting. And I think this push and pull is just continuing aspect of our political discourse, and we'll see what happens on that.
What can we change with respect to registration to make the process easier?
Well, there's two reforms that are working really well in a lot of places. One is automatic voter registration, where the state takes the responsibility of putting everyone on the voter rolls instead of making people opt in, which California has recently adopted and started in Oregon thanks to an innovative thinker named Steve Trout, who basically was getting heat on both sides about the voter registration rolls and came up with an idea to say, why not make people, put people on since we already have their information, as opposed to requiring them to opt in. And this has proven results. The states with the highest voter turnouts have automatic voter registration. It's spread to about a dozen places, both so-called red and so-called blue states. And the other one is same-day registration, which a handful of states have, where you can register to vote on the same day as Election Day. In this day and age of technological advances, you don't need 30 days to check the voter rolls anymore. These states don't have massive voter fraud. That's the common pushback. But, these states like Minnesota don't have issues with voter fraud on Election Day. And again, studies show that same-day registration leads to much higher turnout. So these are reforms that are actually working. They're being implemented thanks to these everyday Americans, these democracy champions, and they improve voter turnout.
And finally, Joshua, what are you most optimistic about and most pessimistic about as it relates to voting?
Well, I'm most optimistic that there is this groundswell, this grassroots effort to expand the electorate, to make it more inclusive, more democratic, and more convenient to vote. And I tell all of these stories in the book that really make me optimistic. Every time I interviewed one of these people, I just rushed to my computer to start writing. I really wanted to tell their stories because they were so inspiring to me. And I hope that they're inspiring to others and give people hope. And so for me, the optimistic thing is this, we have this sentiment that let's throw up our hands and there's so much doom and gloom. And yet the answer is actually no. There are great people on the ground all over the place working to expand the electorate and make voting more convenient and more inclusive and reduce voter apathy. I guess the negativity side is we see partisanship still enter this area, especially where you have legislatures that are thwarting the will of the voters by doing things like you said in Florida, trying to repeal the state constitutional amendment or cut back on it. And you see this in other places like Missouri recently that's trying to undo some laws that the voters just passed there. And so I think, we need as a society to push back against these entrenched politicians from passing rules that are contrary to the will of the voters that really do rig the system.
Joshua Douglas, his most recent book is Vote for Us. Joshua, I thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thanks, Jeff. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And thank you for listening and for joining us here on Radio Who, What, Why. I hope you join us next week for another Radio Who, What, Why podcast. I'm Jeff Sheckman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share and help others find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes. You can also support this podcast and all the work we do by going to whowhatwhy.org/donate.